Hey, everybody, this is Ben Bowman and Alex Titus. Welcome back to another episode of The Oregon Bridge.
I knew how to work hard, and that was something I understood. So I feel like in elected office, I can be that voice for people who don't make it the traditional route. The foundation for shared truth in the media has completely collapsed. We can talk about foreign enemies all we want, but the one thing that is going to destroy our country from within is polarization and misinformation. We need to figure out how to have a shared, trusted source of information. And on these things, we can work together.
All right. Today, we are very, very excited to have a statewide elected official, Labor Commissioner Val Hoyle, former state representative, former majority leader of the Oregon House, and my former boss. I used to work for Commissioner Hoyle back when she was a state representative and the majority leader. She's from the Lane County area. She tells us in this podcast she has a home on some property outside of Springfield. And she's had a pretty interesting trajectory that brought her to the place that she's in today. She spent a long time in the private sector before she transitioned to politics. So this included serving as the board chair of the Federal District Export Council of Oregon, as well as serving on the Outdoor Industry Women's Coalition and helping found the Eugene Chamber of Commerce's International Trade Roundtable. So she's definitely got private sector chops in addition to her public sector chops. She's got an East Coast background, but again, has lived in Lane County for a long time, and now she's the labor commissioner. So Alex, what did you think of the podcast?
It was a fun episode because we covered everything from apprenticeships in Eastern Oregon to big tech and woke politics. So we really went all over the place. And actually, what I thought was interesting is, and she sort of drove the conversation, is that the same topics that came up were almost the exact same as when we had Alex Carlatos on. And they're like, obvious. Well, he's from Roseburg, but I mean, not, I don't know. To me, I just thought that was like both sort of like in that district and, caring about those issues a lot, obviously from different perspectives. But yeah, I thought it was a really unique episode. And she clearly feels really comfortable diving into what I would say are pretty controversial issues. Like most of the politicians we have on the show, I actually think try to stay away from talking about those sorts of things and get themselves some pickles. But I definitely respected that she was willing to engage, I think, pretty openly on a number of pretty controversial and interesting issues. So
100% agree with. That's actually what I was going to say too. It's basically like, I think this is one of our better episodes because it's just very natural and real and an honest conversation. And it doesn't at all come across as like talking points or not even like, not that she wasn't being careful with what she said, but she was just like saying what was on her mind and what she thought. And we did talk a lot about national issues, which I thought is important because that's part of the thesis of this podcast. And Val is someone, she's a very smart political thinker. Like that's why she was so skilled as the majority leader, where part of her job was doing elections for House Democrats. And that comes across when we're talking about these national issues. I think some Oregon figures aren't spending much time thinking about national policy, national political issues. Clearly Val is. So I thought it was a fascinating conversation that really aligns with our thesis meaningfully. So I hope everyone enjoys it. Titus, any final words?
Nope. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you can on your platform. Definitely check us out on YouTube. We're putting up some pretty cool videos on there, and we'll have some additional content coming shortly. So make sure you subscribe there. And feel free to give us 5 stars if your platform also allows us to do that. But thanks again for tuning in.
All right, let's dive into the episode. All right, everybody. We would like to welcome our special guest, Labor Commissioner Val Hoyle. Val, how are you doing today?
Doing great.
It looks like you are not in Portland. It looks like you are home in Springfield.
I live outside of Springfield in the county, but yes, I am in Lane County. I got back after doing a lot of travel. I was back on the East Coast dealing with so older sick parent stuff, and then went to Sun River, went to Portland, got home last night. So I'm very happy to be joining you from just outside of Springfield, Oregon.
That's awesome.
Now, I've got to ask, because I went to school in Eugene, of course, with Ben. Is allergy season over in Springfield and Eugene? Because like literally every summer by June, I felt like I was just waiting to get out the door because I was dying. There's so
Right,
much
yeah.
grass seed floating around in the air from all the grass seed farmers.
That's right. So
in the valley.
we
I was like,
are,
this is the worst thing ever.
I have to explain. So just so you know, I come from New Hampshire, the other state without a sales tax, although in New Hampshire, they not only don't have a sales tax, they don't have an income tax. So, you know, very similar, different accent, but very similar sort of independent, kind of libertarian. We're not out of step with the country's out of step with us, sort of.
The free state, if I'm not mistaken.
It is the free state. Live free or
Yeah.
die. She flies with her own wings. Very similar, different parts of the country. But I have to explain to my friends and family back there that what they think is allergies is nothing like what we have here, because other places 250 parts per million of grass pollen is high. Here it's like 900 parts per million. But that's because we're the grass seed capital of the world. So the World Cup is played with grass that is grown from grass seed that's from Lane and Lynn County, right? So it's bad, it's over. So no worries.
There you go.
And we don't have smoke right now either, which is great. Because this
good.
time last year, quite frankly, I wasn't home. We were evacuated, and it was you know, a lot of my friends and neighbors lost their homes, and we were lucky to have something to come back to. But so no smoke, no real pollen, just, you know, living the good life here in Lane County.
A good time to be in
Good.
Lane County. So before we jump into our like politics questions, I wanted to share a short story and see if I'm sure you do remember this, but so I worked for then Majority Leader Hoyle in 2015. And I was thinking, like, what are my most vivid memories of that experience? And the one that came to mind was, do you remember Senate Bill 612?
Oh my God. It is literally one of the most important things I've done in my life, you know, not just in my elected office, but in my life that actually made a difference. As an elected official, you get to do a lot of things, but there aren't a lot of times when you get to make a fundamental difference in people's lives. And Ben was like, without Ben, we wouldn't have happened.
So this is part of the story I want to share, which is, so I was the point person in Val. This was a Val personal priority bill, not a caucus priority bill. So I was the manager for the bill in her office. And I remember the bill didn't really have a chance of passing at the beginning of the session because it had a price tag on it. So it's going to go to Ways and Means, and some of the education advocacy groups didn't like it because it was going to be a pretty significant change for some of the.
And just to be clear what the bill was, it said that in first grade, every Oregon student should be screened for dyslexia or, you know, visual processing disorder, because if you can be screened and that kind of disability can be found in first grade or second grade, the likelihood that you're going to graduate is significantly higher. And it's very simple. So it's just asking for a screening. So go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, well, so it was that, but it also like required the Department of Education to provide resources, and they had to hire someone. It was like a whole thing. And so it was a great bill, and the advocates were very pumped about it. I mean, they were in your office every week, at least throughout the session, being like, what's going on? What's happening? And so finally it gets scheduled for a public hearing in Senator Roblin's Senate Education Committee. And I do my job as a legislative assistant. I type up your remarks and your testimony. I do it in big font. You go down to the committee. I don't even think they were with you by the time you got to the committee room, but they certainly were not shared. But instead, you told some very personal stories about, you know, what your experience was in elementary school, being told that you weren't college material, up until literally getting to the legislature. And what you told the committee was, when you first started, you felt like you weren't smart enough to be a legislator because you couldn't understand. You were trying to read the first page of this bill and you couldn't get through it. And then something happened when you were 46. You actually finally figured out that you have a visual processing disorder.
Right.
So what I wanted to start.
Sorry, just to clarify, you figured that out at age 46?
46
Wow.
or 47. Yeah, because I called a friend of mine, Judge Ann Aiken, and I said, because I've been appointed in 2009 and I was trying to read through the bill, and it's not that like, I have a college degree. I scan things really well, but in a bill, you have to read every single word in a certain way. And when I came in, I thought that every legislator read every bill. So I thought I was supposed to read every bill. There was only one legislator who read every bill, and that is Cliff Bentz. And weirdly, we shared a staff person, someone that worked for him and then came and worked for me. And she's like, you two could not be more opposite. But I didn't know. I just like through my whole life made assumptions that other people did things better. And I had this thing where, so I called my friend Ann Aiken and she goes, you need to get tested. So I went to this woman who did testing and she said, so you only see 3/4 of the letters. You have you have one eye that doesn't track. And so she said, so you scan. So there's part of the test where you read sentences and they, the normal way, upside down, backwards. I can pretty much read them all, scan them all at the same pace, right? It doesn't matter because when whether it's dyslexia or, what I have is very similar to dyslexia, you compensate, right? So I compensated in other ways, but never knew until that moment that my skills were different and that I was as smart as everyone else. But I was always hiding something for my entire life until this woman said, wow, you recognize letters at the level of a second grader and you've gotten this far. That's pretty impressive. But had I known that in first grade, things would have been so much easier. I mean, who knows where I would be, but I wouldn't have been able to
pass the bill
to this committee about what it meant to be in school. I think I was talking about a second grade teacher who put, there was a turtle up, she put a picture of a turtle with my name on it on the wall because I was so slow in getting my math stuff done, right? So I still remember that to this day, right? And I'm like 57. So, but at that point in time, I wasn't going to run for office because I called her and I said, I can't do this because everybody, because I don't belong here. And she said, you do belong there. You just think differently. Your brain works differently. You see things differently. And that perspective is different. So I went in and we didn't have a chance. We didn't have the votes. And then we got a unanimous vote on the committee, Democrats and Republicans, and most of the committee signed on to co-sponsor the bill. And we passed it. And now it is law. And it's impressive.
Unanimous in both the House and the Senate floor as well. So everybody supported it. And I remember one of the advocates who I love came into the office after the bill was passed and was basically like, okay, so this, or after you've given your testimony, is basically like, okay, so this is happening now. So let's just like work out the details and figure out how to do this. But the question that goes along with that I wanted to ask is, so given this challenging experience you had in the public education, well, it wasn't a public education system, actually. It was a private education system for at least part of it, Catholic school. Does that impact how you approach your job as an elected official? In what ways?
Of course. I think so. My parents sent me to Catholic school. So I'm a second generation American. And, what my parents wanted was for me to have a better life than they had. So the thought at the time was if I went to a Catholic school, that was going to be a better education, which it's a really good education if you learn the same way as other people, right? And there's a lot that I benefited from that 1st through 8th grade. But I think that my challenges, because I didn't process things the same way as other people, and school and getting ahead was never easy. I just had to work harder, and I had in high school, and also it took me 5 years to get through high school. In 9th grade, I just stopped. 9th and 10th grade, I just thought, you know what, I'm not smart enough. I'm never going to graduate. I was told that I wasn't college material. So I went to public school after that. I just stopped trying. And then I met this teacher who was in sort of a resource room for kids that were struggling. And she said, look, you're as smart as any of the other kids, because she suggested I take this college prep class. And I said, well, I'm not smart enough. I'm not college material. I said the things that I had heard my whole life from teachers who were like, well, you're not doing this the way everyone else is. And she said, you're plenty smart enough. You just have to work harder. And that's something I knew how to do. I knew how to work hard. Like, I come from a family my father was a firefighter. My grandfather was a laborer, helped start, he was one of the founding members of the laborers union in New York. And my mother worked hard, to get ahead. And so I knew how to work hard, and that was something I understood. So I feel like in elected office, I can be that voice for people who don't make it the traditional route, right? Like every single day and every single thing I've done, I think about the fact that no one expected me to graduate from high school. And here I am, the labor commissioner, and I got a bachelor's degree, and I had a really great time as an international salesperson, selling bicycles. I've gone all over the world. I've done, I have this amazing family and live in Oregon. And so I feel like I have an opportunity to speak up for those people who don't have a voice, who don't think they have a chance. And that's why I love what I do. So I do think it makes a difference. It's a different perspective. And I also think my district, I do have to say, the first time I met Ben Bowman, I have to tell this story. So I got appointed in 2009 to fill Chris Edwards' spot. So my district was Junction City, Alvador, Cheshire, which are super conservative, parts of West Eugene, so 3 precincts that are super liberal, and then Bethel, which is, and there's 27 manufactured home parks in that district. So Bethel is not a wealthy community, but it's a very tight community and blue collar, where people just, they want their kids to have a good education, they want to do better, they want good jobs, they want the government to do its job, but not to be too invasive. So, it is very much a microcosm of our state. And I had come from an urban background and had never been in a rural area before. So I went out to a bunch of farmers and talked to them, and they were great in helping educate me on, what they needed for the district. But it was 2010 and I was running for office, and Alex, as you can imagine, 2010 was not a great year for Democrats.
It was a fantastic year for America.
Yeah.
We make little jokes sometimes.
Tomato. So I knew the district because I had been working on school bond measures. So I came here, and one of my children has a similar learning disability that I have, and I knew how much I struggled in school. And my thought was, I want to make schools better for my kids, and not just my kids, but all the kids. So we came from Wisconsin, where my child had access to occupational therapy 3 days a week, had, in kindergarten, and they said, we want to prep you for school. We came here, and I was told that, she wasn't quite at the point where she could get services, but if in 3rd grade, she still had trouble reading and writing, they would give her services. Well, what we know is if you can't read in 3rd grade, the likelihood that you're going to graduate is significantly less. So I started talking to my legislators and working on bond measures, and this new group was organized in our area, Stanford Children. So I worked with Stanford Children, right? So I got involved working in West Eugene and Bethel on school bond measures, right? So I knew people there, and I'm knocking on the doors, and I thought, I don't think I'm going to win. And none of my colleagues were like, we did polling and you're 8 to 12 points up. And I'm like, I don't think that's true, because I was knocking on doors and talking to people who had worked in the coach factories, right? Or worked in mills that were gone, and said, I used to be able to make $60,000, $70,000 a year. I used to have insurance. I used to be able to take care of my family. And things were really bad, and our economy was crashing, and people were unhappy. So Ben was an intern on my campaign. So we were in this building that was, it was just this open building, and I was in this corner small office making phone calls and then going out and knocking on doors. And Ben was an intern, and my impression, I was thinking about this earlier, was you were so excited about everything.
I was so excited about everything.
Used a lot of words.
Still true. Podcast format is perfect for me.
Yes, it's true. But man, it didn't matter what needed to be done. Ben was like, I'll do it. And then he would actually do it, and he would follow through. So that year, it was kind of great, because I'd knock on doors and people would say, I'm not voting for an incumbent. And I would say, this is my first election. And then, I also got to say, well, I'm your representative. So it was kind of a good thing. So there were only 2 Democrats in swing seats that won that year. And that was myself and Arnie Roblin. And I was the only new Democrat in a swing seat to win. And I think it was because the messaging that I had was, I want to stand up for good schools. I want to, focus on jobs and making sure that people can make a good living, because I know what it meant for my family to be able to have a path to the middle class. And that's really what we've lost. And I think that where we are now and what happened in 2010, and the divisiveness we have in our country is a loss of the ability for Americans to have a path to the middle class. I mean, we have more income inequality than we've had since, right before the Depression. So
yeah, and I think we'll dive into that in just a little bit. I did want to go back to something you said, which I thought was really interesting. You're like, well, part of my district was, really conservative, and part of it was really rural, and there was farmers, and I didn't know anything about farming. So I went up to the farmers and said, what is farming? What do you do?
Yeah.
I think that's maybe to you that didn't seem like an important point, but to me I thought that was really interesting, because one thing we talk about a lot is kind of the urban rural divide. And I think that you started to see kind of fissures of that in 2008 and in 2010, but I mean, that's really escalated and accelerated, I would say, today. But I think that a lot of people, and I agree with this point to some extent. I think some people push even further, is sort of saying that a lot of Democrats, at least, and not just in this state, but across the country, they've really consolidated support around urban communities and really just don't really care about rural voters anymore. And what I actually think some of the Democrats we'd have on this show, like Jamie McLeod Skinner, would agree with that. But I thought sort of that outreach was interesting you were talking about. And I know that.
So
sorry,
I would say 2 things. So one really funny story. There is one of the farmers that I had reached out to, and I would call when I had questions about agriculture, because I'm not an expert, he's an expert. And he serves on the school board in Junction, and he was at a Farm Bureau meeting and talked to a friend of mine, and he said, gosh, Val's been really good for us. Like, she's there whenever we have a question, when we need anything, she's right there. But I've never voted for a Democrat. I just don't know if I can vote for her, right? Like, so we have it on both sides. But I also want to point out, Alex, that previous, 30 years ago, maybe a bit longer, but 30 years ago, because as things started to consolidate, we had over 200 swing districts. Right now, we have about 35, 2 of which are in Oregon. Yep. So when you don't have a swing district, and when you draw maps that pack, right, urban areas and, different communities into partisan areas, both red and blue, then you get people from those districts that have to go into a partisan primary, going all the way to the left, all the way to the right. So I actually think we did better when we had more swing districts and more people going to Congress that didn't have to play to just one side or the other. Because that, and so 2010 specifically changed the map to a point that I think it makes it difficult. So we can talk about the fact that, well, it's the rural-urban divide, but let's be perfectly clear. We have 2 different sets of information. And I know, you work for the Trump team. So, Steve Bannon was a very big impact on how they message. And, the foundation for shared truth in the media has completely collapsed, and we have to agree on that. So my neighbor.
100% agree on that.
Yeah. My neighbor's the nicest person in the world, and believes things that I know for a fact are not true. But the information that he gets, and again, Bannon's idea was not put out misinformation, right? And so our media, you want to call it mainstream media or whatever, is set up on the premise that, you have to report facts. You might report them here or there. When I grew up, I'm older than you. So, we would watch Walter Cronkite, right? Like, that was the news, and you could think this or that, but the news was the news. Well, the idea from Bannon was to just put out so much information that people got overloaded and confused, and there was misinformation. And So my neighbor has a completely different sense of what's happening. Even though he knows I'm an elected official and we can talk about facts, he believes that like 40% of Americans, 35 to 40%, that the election was stolen, that Joe Biden has Alzheimer's, that
Vaccine is,
the
probably,
vaccine,
yeah.
and that people. I talked to someone 2 nights ago. I stayed 6 feet away from him and I had a mask, but he said, yeah, I'm not vaccinated because in my church of 5,000 people, I don't know anyone who died. My wife is a nurse and I know 5 people that died from the vaccine. And I was like, wait, what? And he said, yes. He said, I know 5 people, 1 from a blood clot, 2 from heart attacks, and 2 from strokes that had these within 1 to 3 months of getting the vaccine. And I said, well, vaccine reactions happen between 24 and 72 hours. And so that's not a thing. But in his mind, that's what he believes. This is not a stupid person. This is a person that has a vastly different set of information. And so we can talk about the rural urban divide. And there is a great book written by actually the lobbyist for the Oregon rural electric co-ops, Ted Case, and it's called Power Plays. And it talks about how rural electric co-ops influenced presidential elections and the winners of the presidential election from Roosevelt to Reagan. And, at that point in time, rural areas could influence how the elections happen. But right now we have polarization and hyperpartisanship. And I think that we would be delusional to think that anybody could go out and say, let's just have a kumbaya, because we're talking off of different sets of information in a way that I think is quite dangerous.
Yeah, so I disagree with your point necessarily, though, that it was Bannon, because I mean, even if you go all the way back to like when George Bush was president, there's some pretty significant polling that a lot of Democrats thought President Bush was involved in 9/11. So I mean, like, this is a significantly not longer term in terms of this was happening hundreds of years ago, but I mean, like, since the 2000s, totally agree. Information has become internet,
social media,
more access to information, and social media too. And we can definitely talk a little bit about that. But I'm curious from your perspective, because this seems like such like a paradox, actually, in a sense, of that as information has been democratized, right? In some ways that like anybody can be a reporter, anybody can put out content. I mean, you can look at Ben, right? Like Ben is not a trained journalist. He's not a professional journalist. And like we put out this publication called The Liftoff, and like a lot of interesting and influential people read it. And Ben and I have basically no experience in journalism, but like now because of online tools, right? Like we have access to where people can come and find our information that even I would say 10 years ago would be very difficult. I mean, I guess you could argue there was blocking, but like, I guess, what do you kind of make of that, right? That like literally as more information has become and like more people can put out information, like clearly more sort of misinformation. People are becoming like more siloed where they get information because there's just so much of it of like, do you kind of agree that is the problem? And like, two, what do you think maybe are some solutions to help kind of combat that?
So I wish I had a solution. Because I think it is, we can talk about foreign enemies all we want, but the one thing that is going to destroy our country from within is polarization and misinformation. Mm-hmm. And with the internet and, the different sources of information and the lack of ability to know what to fact check, right? The lack of ability to fact check. I mean, families are being split. We can talk about QAnon because, whether you're right or left, I don't think anyone here is, I don't know, Alex, are you
Ben sent me some articles from some websites.
It's a lot like that, that people actually thought Pizzagate was real, that people actually thought that Wayfair was naming their wardrobes.
I was deeply suspicious, to be fair.
Because, well, whatever, maybe bad choice in marketing, but like, and there are lots of examples of bad choices in marketing, but like that they thought people were ordering children, that Oprah and the Clintons and Obamas were, pedophiles that were getting whatever from murdering children. Like, how did we get here? And how is it that people I know believe some of this stuff, that we're splitting families, right? Like families are being split because of this misinformation. So we're not talking about shared information. And until we can get to that point, and you're right, Steve Bannon didn't start it. Absolutely not. But Steve Bannon took it and moved it to a new level, and is quite frankly brilliant at using the internet, and whether it's Breitbart or any of these other
well, actually, I mean, it's really Facebook of what the Trump campaign was able to exploit in terms of marketing, because they basically said, we have all these rural voters. They're very hard to reach by traditional means, but they all have Facebook. So now we can advertise to them. And I feel like that was kind of like the infancy in terms of not only like political campaigns, but just news in general, in terms of people figured out very quickly, like, holy, this is a really powerful tool that can be, you can really micro target with this stuff and like really feed specific people information that they want. And yeah, I don't know if you've been like in the news recently, there's been some, I'd actually encourage everybody to go look at this in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal has this like expose from the last week they've been doing called the Facebook Files. And there is just some crazy stuff in there about like Facebook algorithms, like Instagram addiction, and like young girls committing suicide at like higher rates and things like that, and becoming more depressed. Like, it's absolutely crazy. But I mean, no, you're totally right that like social media just threw like, I wouldn't even say like gas. They threw like an oil tanker basically on the fire to just blow this up.
Well, and then you have traditional media that is responding in a way that they repeat the lie. And I will just go to the fact that there are so many people that believe fundamentally, absolutely, that the election was stolen, right? Like, let's take Georgia. Georgia is not overseen by Democrats. Brian, I know and work with the labor commissioner from Georgia because, and let me just take a step back. So as the commissioner of the Bureau for Labor and Industries, we oversee wage and hour enforcement in employment law and housing, oversee wage and hour enforcement, oversee civil rights enforcement in employment and housing. We register the apprenticeship programs for the state. And then we have a technical assistance division that provides free information for businesses that want to know how to follow the law. Like, how do I hire someone? How do I fire someone? How do I handle pay equity when I have 10 people and they all do the same thing, right? Like, we're there for free information for business. So that's what we do. So but I'm an elected official, and there's only 4 labor commissioners in the country that are elected. The rest are appointed. So in 1903, the legislature determined that this office should be accountable to the people of the state and not to another elected official. And this is the only statewide office that is nonpartisan. So anyway, just a little, here's what your labor commissioner does, because I've done polling and nobody knows, literally nobody knows. Like, there's like 8 of us in the state. More than that.
Two of us are on this call. So.
Yeah,
and the rest are former labor commissioners. So
that's exactly right. So, and then Jack Roberts, the last Lane County labor commissioner in the 80s, made the position, advocated for and had the position made nonpartisan. So that is only fairly recent. So I work with the labor commissioner from Georgia, and I reached out to him and I'm like, hey, sorry, buddy, but it's not like you can say that Brian Kemp or, the Secretary of State Raffensperger are in any way liberal.
Liberals, yeah.
And yet you have so many Republicans that believe that election was stolen, to the point that Raffensperger and his staff were getting death threats. This is dangerous. And what would have happened if the count for the Electoral College had been stopped? What the fact that we had an attempted insurrection, whatever you want to think about this, fringe group, that happened, and people don't believe it happened because we don't have a shared source of information. So I think we need to preserve our democratic republic, and I won't go on about all of this, we need to figure out how to have a shared, trusted source of information. And I do think it is the responsibility of social media to ensure that what is coming out are facts. But when, people are not allowed to be on Twitter or to put out information that's actually factually false, then they say, well, this is censorship. Well, it's not censorship if you're line, but I don't know what the solution. I would love to hear from both of you, specifically you, Alex. What is the solution to get back to a singular or a shared frame of reference for what the truth is?
Yeah, and we actually just did an episode with our producer, and we dove into this topic quite a bit. But I actually have a pretty, I'd say, pessimistic outlook on this. I actually don't even think it's as bad as it will get, because I think that in terms of, unless there's regulation, and there might be regulation, right? Because the most interesting thing when it comes, at least in my mind, to big tech is that you have not only Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who are like absolutely ready to just drop the hammer on companies like Facebook and Twitter, you also have Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, who are just as eager to maybe even drop a harder hammer in some circumstances on this. But like, in terms of where, at least from the political lens, and I don't even know as much about the journalist lens, but like, this will get, the information people will receive will be even shorter than it is now in the future. So like, for example, my former boss, he's big GOP consultant, et cetera, et cetera. Like, he says very much in the future that like political ads will no longer even be like 30-second things on TV. That will probably last for a while, but we'll even move further to like, here's a 4-second ad on what Val Hoyle stands for on your Instagram feed, or like, here's 4 seconds of why you should oppose Val Hoyle. And like, that's even just kind of dumbing down.
And honestly, it sounds like Idiocracy. It's like that movie Idiocracy, where we're just like dumbing things down. The other thing I wanted to add is like, so to the regulation point, Titus, let's say that they do pass these regulations that are basically what most people are talking about is targeted specifically at Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. Well, there's something else happening in the background here, which is conservatives are already sort of imagining what is going to happen, and they're building their own platforms. So pretty soon, we're not even going to be on the same platforms. We're all going to be on our own specific platforms aligned with our political ideologies, which is going to really make things worse.
But we already are, because of the way the algorithms happen. So
yeah,
even if we're on the same platforms, we're getting information. We're getting different information. And so you have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren saying that, yeah, big tech does need to be, regulated more. But to say that Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio want the same thing or even more, what they want is for people to be able to say whatever they want without regulation.
Well, no, I would disagree with that. Like, one of Hawley's big things is about like addiction for children on like things like Instagram and YouTube and stuff.
Yeah, no,
like, I actually
agree.
think they're much.
What is that? The social dilemma that really goes into that quite well. I do think that piece is important. That, like, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and on that.
So before we started recording, Val warned us that the the show outline we had constructed was going to quickly go out the window, which is already true. But I do think, we've got about looks like 20 minutes or so left, and I do want to transition a little bit to talk about Oregon specifically. And so here's the bridge from national to local. So Donald Trump was very successful at winning over working class voters in the Midwest in particular, or at least more successful than past GOP candidates. And this has not happened at all in Oregon, at least not that I could see. Or maybe you disagree. You think that there have been working class swings. I guess you'd point to like
Absolutely.
the coastal districts.
I mean, the precinct I live in, but I was just at a building trades convention, and these are people who do not tend to vote. They're not from Portland, right? And they tend to vote more conservative, but like, say, if you have union members or people that used to work in the mills, which is what happened with the coast, similar to a lot of other places, whether it's Michigan and losing the jobs in the auto industry, or it's the coast losing the jobs in the timber industry or fishing, or Junction City with the manufacturing, with coach manufacturing, or in the building trades, where you have people that would ordinarily tend to vote Republican and maybe came from Republican families, and they're more rural, but they vote on wages, hours, working conditions, right? Benefits. But when those jobs were gone and they lost that, right? And I personally think it's if you can see when we lost union membership and you have the differentiation between CEOs pay and working people's pay, again, losing that path to the middle class, it really came about that. So I do think that this has happened in Oregon. And I have to say, we've moved forward with a false premise, like, because I worked in the legislature. I have to say, Alex and Ben can testify to this. I had very good relationship, even though I'm the majority leader, and that is thought of as the most partisan position, right? Like, you move forward the agenda of your caucus, right? That was my job. I did it well. But I had very good relationships with Republicans because I did represent a swing district and a mixed district. And I felt like they showed up to do the job and represent their members, their constituents, the same as I did. And so I actually had a Thomas Jefferson quote that was on my desk. And it's, in matters of style, swim with the current, and in matters of substance, stand like a rock. And I think that we just mix up substance and style way too often. So if you're clear about, here are the things I'm going to do, here are the things that I'm never going to bend on, and on these things we can work together, and you're clear and you're honest and you respect other people, I think that goes a long way. But we have a false premise of moderation with the goal of undermining the effectiveness and trust in government. And I think I have seen that over and over again. Like, well, why don't you come to the middle? Like, why are you pushing for this? But I think Oregonians deserve access to public services, and those public services need to be treated with transparency and honesty. And when you do that, like I will say, I won 17 counties, none of them on the east side, but that's a lot. Liberal counties, conservative counties. But I went to John Day after I got elected. I went to the John Day Chamber. And I will note that I've spoken in as many rural chambers as I have unions, like gone to union membership meetings. So I went to John Day and I said, hi, I'm the new labor commissioner. Here's what we do. Want to work with you. And some guy said, we're not used to seeing West Siders except when they're running for election. And I said, well, I'm a Democrat and you weren't going to vote for me. So I figured I would come after I got elected to see how we could work together. And what they said was, we have West Siders come over and they want to attract new businesses and companies. What we need training for the people we have here, because we have places that want to hire people. We need housing. We need, so we talked about that. And one of the first things I did was advocated for a position in Eastern Oregon for an apprenticeship and business technical assistance rep. Fought for it again this cycle and we got it funded. It's the first time we've had a presence in Eastern Oregon in over 20 years for the Bureau of Labor and Industries, right? Do I think that that's going to get me votes? No, maybe a few, not a lot. But it doesn't matter. Just like in Junction City, I was never going to win Junction City, but I worked really hard to represent that community because it was my job. And so I work really hard to try and understand the needs of the entire state. And I think, again, you say what you're going to do, you do it, and operate with transparency and honesty. And that's what I think public servants should do. I know I didn't answer your question. I answered.
No.
I wanted you to ask.
It was interesting and helps me reframe my question, which is, it's really about, so Alex has a thesis that he talks about, which is that the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly, like, it used to be that the rich people voted for Republicans and the Republican Party was the party of the rich. And Titus believes that there's a shift happening where, like, all the West Hills are all voting for Democrats, and that there's some cultural shift happening beneath the surface here, which I'm curious. Do you think there's a world in which
do you think only wealthy people live in the West Hills? I mean, like, the Koch brothers are not voting for Democrats, and they're very wealthy, right? Jeff Bezos.
Well, actually, even to be fair with them, they've actually rebranded quite a bit to become much more moderate in that. But I'll reframe my point.
I would say libertarian as opposed to moderate. There's difference.
Fair. Yeah. I'll reframe the point a little bit for Ben. So, like, my thing, and I've actually talked about this quite a bit on the podcast, is like the sort of, and I don't know if West Hills is a great example, but like maybe the suburbs
like Oswego.
Yeah, the LO people, right, used to sort of be the country club Republican. Actually, West Lynn is a great example too. Like the country club Republicans, And again, maybe West Lynn was never, Lake Oswego was never like 90% Republican, 10% Democrat. Maybe someone will fact check me and say like, well, technically in 1930, but like, we're just going to leave it at that. But those areas, like in terms of like the upper middle class in general, have just become much more liberal. And I don't think that we've just seen that in Oregon, but that's been kind of like across the country trend.
But have they, Alex, or has the Republican Party shifted so far? So Kerry Timchuk, right? Like he worked for Gordon Smith, right? Nobody could say Gordon Smith was not a conservative. He was, worked on a number of things, worked for the state, worked closely with Wyden. And, Kerry Timchuk had a fundraiser for Biden, right? This is a Republican who has said, and like I have heard so many, like my in-laws, when they immigrated from here, they worked for the Republican Party in Michigan. They no longer are Republicans because they feel like the party, especially as immigrants, right? They feel like the Republican Party has gone so far off the edge, right? So is it that you have wealthy people or people that used to be those country club Republicans coming over to the Democratic Party, or are they just saying that party that has supported the insurrection and has said that all the elections are stolen, they're not really where I'm at anymore?
So I think that is happening, but at the same time, I think the coalition that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson had of the poorest people in this country supporting Democrats has also shifted, where those voters are saying the Democratic Party's lost it. They're crazy, they're woke, they're whatever. And so that's the thing that I get hung up on is.
So you know who you should talk to, and she just bought a house in Oregon. It's Rachel Bidicoffer. So she did work with the Lincoln Project, worked with Midas Touch, has a Strike Pack, and her thesis is that it really has come down to the split between college educated voters and non-college educated voters. And
yeah, but that's essentially just another way of saying wealthy people versus non-wealthy people, right? Like I to me, it's just crazy. Well, it's not crazy because I think that Republicans have basically given wealthy people a free pass forever on some of this stuff, especially when I would say wealthy people who very much don't like the people who actually vote for the Republican Party, is that like people at Nike who make $150,000 a year, like don't really care about economic issues. Like they vote sort of more on cultural issues now. Even though it might necessarily be better of them saying, well, you should vote for Alex Titus because Alex Titus wants to cut your taxes. They'll say, well, no, I'm going to vote for Val because Val actually stands with some of these like maybe social or cultural issues, LGBT, which are more important to me now. Yeah.
I think the key is, and one of the things, like I said, I won 17 counties, and it's interesting because this is a nonpartisan race. So because I didn't have a D or R after my name, I think I was able, now it's clear if you look at the voters pamphlet statement who was supporting me that I'm a Democrat. I've been a Democrat since I, registered to vote at 18. But you can get your message through, and a message of standing up for working people, holding bad actors accountable, leveling the playing field for those employers that follow the rules, and expanding apprenticeship. You know what? It is really popular. And when you don't have a letter after your name and that partisan filter, like, because I won Coos and Curry and Clatsop and Columbia counties, right? Because people there really care about jobs, about good paying jobs, about apprenticeship. Also, I would love to talk about apprenticeship as a model for how we can move forward, because I think it's really important and I think it gets stigmatized. And this is that bridge between people who don't go to college and, college educated people.
What do you mean stigmatized?
Yeah, actually,
sorry, go ahead. But I didn't want to jump from that one subject, but I do want to just would love to talk about apprenticeship.
Let's pivot. When you're talking about it being stigmatized, do you mean like, oh, that's for poor people? That's not something.
Yeah, it really is. If you look, and part of this was when we, cut funding to our schools, and, as they cut, one of the first things they cut was shop classes in CTE, and, guidance counselors and teachers, there is the premise that if you're smart, you go to college. And if you're not good enough to go to college, well, then I guess you could go in the trades. Well, let me tell you something. As a journey line worker, electrical line worker, right? So you will be making 6 figures easy with your journey card with 0 debt. So, that's a big deal. And you tell me, you go for a liberal arts degree, you've got kids with $100,000 in debt fighting for $15 an hour. How can you tell me that an apprenticeship program is not the path? The other thing is 36% of jobs in Oregon require a college degree, right? Like you don't want your brain surgeon saying, hey, I did this apprenticeship and that was good. And you've got 14% of jobs that require a GED or a college education, and 50% of jobs require some kind of mix. So if you look at an apprenticeship as a triangle, right, with an industry standard, for instance, I'm working with Amazon on a logistics and distribution apprenticeship program. A journey card from Amazon with a certification in logistics and distribution can get you a job anywhere with no college debt, right? We're doing an apprenticeship program with the cannabis industry, but fundamentally, apprenticeships are seen as a second-rate option to people who can't go to college. And both with the cost of college education, the way we fund universities, and the workforce needs that aren't being met, I think that apprenticeship can use colleges, right? Can use job training and then fit workforce needs better. And that will also make up for all the experiences kids haven't gotten in the pandemic because they haven't been able to show up at school, right? Like, so they don't build those soft skills.
Well, so actually, super interesting point, because I feel like so many people, especially more so on the left, really push the higher education route. But I'm hyping the Wall Street Journal up a lot on this podcast, but they also
I read it every day. So.
Okay, great. So I imagine you probably read some of the exposés on higher education, which I literally sent so many annoying texts to Ben about this. He probably wants to kill me, but some of that information was legitimately like it hurt my stomach to learn that there is students who are $350,000 in debt and they're making $40,000 a year out of college. Like that physically made me sick. I'm like, where is the GOP? Where are the Dems? Like, why is this sort of happening? But I feel like, and this because there is apprenticeships you can come out of and start making like $60K a year, $70K a year with benefits that are really good jobs with higher earning potential too. How do you think we go about
$150,000 or $200,000? But here's the thing. When I went to college, so I went to community college for the first 2 years, and it was $367 a semester. And then I went to a private college, Emmanuel College in Boston, and it was $7,600 or $7,700. That school is now $52,000 a year, right? So the difference was that I was someone who, as a working student on Pell Grants, who was the first person in my family to graduate from college, that I could afford to go to school without having crippling debt. And the problem is the prices have increased so much, right? And we don't pay social workers enough to pay for the college education. So we need to fix the model, and the apprenticeship model, which most people only think about it as the trades, and the trades have great apprenticeships, thousands of years of experience with their apprenticeship programs. But I think we should look at that model for other things. Yesterday, we approved, or was it the day before? I can't remember. It's been a long week. This week, we approved an apprenticeship program for professional firefighting, for alcohol and drug counselors, for mental health counselors. We did another one. But the apprenticeship model needs to be destigmatized and utilized so that we don't have kids with crippling debt, and we do have the workforce that business needs. Because right now they're getting someone with a liberal arts degree, right, or a high school degree or something, but it doesn't quite fit their needs. So we also have a veterans program, sort of a take on the helmets to hard hat program in my office to help veterans match the skills they had to jobs that are available. We just hired the first DEI officer within our apprenticeship programs to make sure that so that our workforce is reflective of the communities they live in. Because I will just say, in the trades, the recruitment model has been what we call the FBI model: father, brother, in-law. If your father or brother or in-law has been in the trades, you get into the trades. Otherwise, people don't know that literally you can go through an apprenticeship program as a man, as a woman, as someone who identifies as BIPOC, maybe never occurred to you, and may have no college debt and be making six figures. When was the last time you tried to get an electrician or a plumber? They are in high demand, right?
I just had to, my hot water heater in my new house just went out, and I'm not kidding. So we're recording this on September 17th. I called last week, and there were I called probably 10 or 15 plumbers. Some of them were booked out until the end of October, And they were upfront about it. They weren't even like trying to schedule me. They were just like, yeah, I'm probably not gonna be able to help you. I can't, I'm booked out until the end of October. And I'm like, but so the one piece I wanted to add on this before we move on is I actually think that there's a lot of K-12 education that needs to be integrated into all of this, because part of it is like, what are we inspiring students to imagine for their futures? And for so long, the narrative has been like, if you're not going to college, then you're not meeting your full potential. And that has to be shifted really early, because if you're waiting till they get to their junior year of high school, I feel like for a lot of students, there's already this like mental block of like, oh, that's that path.
And that's, I was talking to previous president of OHSU, Joe Robertson, and he said, our problem isn't that we're not getting kids out of high school. It's that we need the kind of math taught in fourth grade that will allow people to become doctors, right? Like fourth grade is where we need to be working. But the other piece is letting people know that, again, these opportunities are available, utilizing apprenticeship as a model outside the building and construction trades. And I think, in Oregon, we're really leading. I have to give total credit. I have this amazing staff. So my apprenticeship director managed the helmets to hard hat program for the 11-state Southeast region for the national building trades unions. So she is a Black female Marine Corps veteran and has come in, and I said, I want you to expand apprenticeships inside the trades and make sure we have more diversity and opportunity for people, and outside the trades. And she has just really embraced it, and it's exciting. So I think it's been high school or college and then maybe apprenticeships. But with Measure 98, we have money for career technical education. And I know right here in Thurston, which is the Springfield High School I'm closest to, they have, there's computer sciences, there's healthcare, there's, all kinds of things. And again, we just have to rethink how we are offering opportunities to fit workforce needs and provide good paying job opportunities.
Great. And then just the last thing we wanted to ask, because we know that we have to let you go here in just a couple minutes, but so your agency made some headlines over the past few months with allegations of bias. And we know that with recent reports that just came out, at least from what the Oregonian was saying, is that the independent investigator in this essentially has exonerated you from this. And we know that there's still some lawsuits pending, but could you kind of just tell us a little bit about the situation and what happened from your perspective?
I can't. Both because there's lawsuits pending, and what I would rather focus on is what it means to change culture. So when I came to this agency, it was a third the size, and I am answering your question, Alex, but not exactly. It was a third the size it was 40 years ago. So Mary Wendy Roberts, right, who left office in, I can't remember, it was by early 80s, maybe 78. She had 260 people, and I came in and had 103. We have a significantly larger state, wow, right? And more laws. And so I walked into an agency that really hadn't moved on. So our website was like an example of the worst website in state government. Like they just didn't pay to upgrade it. So it was like four, back from what everyone else had. And it was in 8-point print, printed at law school or graduate school level with PDFs buried. So like we improved the website so that people didn't have to sign a wage claim form, right, with a wet signature, which was what was demanded. We stopped charging people for their own records by the pound of paper, because that was a thing. There was a 2-page policy on how to eat lunch at your desk and nothing for customer service, right? These were employees that, were evaluated by how they checked the boxes, but we really weren't strategic in how we enforced the law. So
the eating lunch at your desk policy is Alex Titus's like caricature of how all state government works.
No, and it was the
This is literally going to be a campaign ad now.
No, and let me be clear, that's not my employee's fault.
Yeah.
And it was like, we don't have the resources to help people. So we will not necessarily actively put up barriers, but like they had to pick and choose who they would service. So coming from the private sector, I both have been a union member and worked in the private sector for 25 years. So I come in with both perspectives. And so I thought the number one thing we need to do is focus on customer service. So if something doesn't get the customer service, we should not be doing it. There was one place in apprenticeship where we found there was something that they were doing, and it took 7 or 8 hours a week, that had been started 8 years ago. And it was for an audit that needed to be for 3 months, but nobody ever stopped it. So they just kept doing it, right? So we've process mapped out everything. And I brought in people from outside of state government, and also I don't know if to say bias, but the go-to in hiring people in this agency was to hire people from within. Now, I've hired some people from within, but what we do is we set up a policy that every single job would be open to the outside. And if somebody from inside wanted to compete for it, they needed to compete outside as well. We started advertising our jobs outside of from where people just look for state agency jobs, right? Because then you get state agency people with, the person who was the deputy before my deputy had worked at Boley for 42 years. Unbelievable work ethic, really smart, really cared about things, but she had never worked at anywhere but Boley. So my wage and hour director came from also the National Building Trade. She was their lobbyist. And before that, the AFL-CIO was the lobbyist on Capitol Hill on immigration policy. Her parents were undocumented farm workers. Father became a laborer, and their life got better, right? She lived in farm worker housing. So when she looks at the policies and goes to farm worker housing, this is not a foreign concept. When we look at prevailing wage or implementing the new collective bargaining law, right? Like, she understands what it means to be on a work site. She knows how to work with the Association of General Contractors, because she did that on Capitol Hill and also has been on work sites, and with workers. So we are now a national model for outreach to workers, right? Because Sonia Ramirez, who's my wage and hour director, is working with Rutgers to figure out how can we outreach to workers better. But the bottom line is, since we've been there, 83% of our hires identify as BIPOC. And that is specifically because we've advertised and allowed different people to apply. Now, when you bring people that are different and come from different backgrounds and not from state government and have different cultures, it's not easy, right? And we had to acknowledge that. We started a DEI committee. We started more regular and open conversations with our union and the Joint Labor Management Committee. I started communicating with my workers. We made sure that the culture in our office meant that you were not allowed to treat people in a way that was inappropriate. So is it easy? And is there going to be bumps, as you've seen? Yeah, it's not always easy, but fundamentally, what my staff saw during the pandemic was that we put our workers first, right? Like, we only had 2 VPNs because, and if you wanted a laptop, no lie, before we came in, you had to write like an email and a reason for why you could possibly need to take a laptop and work outside the building, which meant that if you're an investigator and you're sitting in an interview room and you had to take notes, you'd have to go back and rewrite those notes as opposed to putting them on a computer. So we completely changed that, transfer people to work at home. One of the first things we asked for was a public records person. So this is all about culture change. I'm not answering your question, Alex, but so we asked for a public records person so that one person could do our public records. We stopped charging for records, and she has managed to move us from paper. I cannot tell you how much paper we use. They would print out emails and then put them in a file. That's
Wow.
Just ridiculous. So we've actually transferred, because we've transferred the culture and we brought new people in. I asked the legislature for money because I feel like I hired good staff, right? Not everyone's a fit and not all of it's easy, and it hasn't been easy for my staff. It hasn't been easy for us, but I can say 2.5 years later, where both labor and business really had issues with my agency, I have support from business and from labor moving forward because they feel like we're operating with customer service. And our focus really has gone to keeping bad actors accountable and focus on those bottom feeders and helping the people that just made little mistakes. Like if you didn't get a paycheck out within the 24 hours because you couldn't find the person, that's one thing. If you pay your white workers $4 more than your non-white workers, actual true example, that's not a mistake. So we should be spending our energy here to level the playing field. And I've talked to the legislature, and now we're going to have 131 people. We're going to have fair housing people throughout the state, Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon, Southern Oregon here. But the culture inside the agency has changed. And fundamentally, it's hard. It's hard to deal with the reality. It's hard to get people who haven't dealt with someone from another culture to understand how to do that and to do that in a professional way. And we've had issues, as you've read about in the paper, but what I can say is when those things came up, we dealt with them openly. And I think my agency is better for it because we had an independent investigation because, quite frankly, I didn't know what was true and not true. And I wanted to know what was true and not true. And I want to make sure that whatever we're responsible for, that we take care of, so that anybody who works in my agency knows if they show up and they do their job and they focus on customer service, we will do our best to make sure that the Bureau of Labor and Industries is a safe and fun and exciting place to work. Also, we're looking for a communications director.
You heard it here first. If you want to go be Val's comms director, well, I think that's a really good place to end it. And we did go a little over time, so we apologize for that.
I'm sorry for using
no.
Words and focusing on the social media dilemma, but it's kind of a thing.
We love it. And also we could go on even longer. We apologize for taking your time. But okay, so last question for all of our guests. If someone is interested in the work you're doing, we also saw that you told KLCC you were running for re-election. If they want to get involved in your campaign, how can folks be in touch with you?
So first of all, if you are an employee and you want to know what your rights are, or you have your wages stolen or your rights violated, or if you're an employer and you would like to have information about employment law, know that our technical assistance division has a clear firewall to our enforcement division. So if you call and ask for help, we do not transfer that information because I want to help people ask for help. Go to oregon.gov/BOLI. If you would like to support me in my next election for labor commissioner, again, best job I've ever had, you can go to valhoyle.com. Also, I have some videos that I did at the beginning of the pandemic where I didn't know what to do and I wanted new recipes. So I interviewed a number of different people and asked them their favorite recipe and then to talk about something. I have everyone from Shelley Bossart sharing it was like some kind of pie crisp recipe, to like one of the members of the Grand Run Tribal Council talking about elk stew and the story of the pandemic from their tribal perspective. It was a thing. It's over, but it's
that is awesome. Well, Commissioner Hoyle, thank you once again for joining us. And for our listeners, thanks for tuning in. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. All right. Thanks, everybody.
And thanks, Ben. And thanks for helping me get elected in 2010.
You're welcome. And I'm sorry.
You know what? That made us 30-30 in the House. Without that, it would have shifted all things. So sorry about that, Alex. You have
Ben's been blamed for many things.